The ocean has always been more than water and waves. To sailors of centuries past, it was alive, an unpredictable force with moods of its own. It could bless them with calm winds and bountiful fish, or it could rise in fury, shattering wood and bone without warning. And so long before science offered explanations, sailors looked for patterns, signs, and rituals. They turned to superstition not because they were foolish, but because the sea itself demanded it.
Picture a wooden ship in the 17th century, its sails stretched like the wings of a giant bird. The horizon is endless, the world reduced to nothing but sky above and water below. The crew, hardened men from villages and cities scattered across Europe, know the dangers ahead: disease, starvation, storms, and enemy ships. But more than anything, they fear what they cannot see. And so they whisper, they perform rituals, they cling to omens and warnings that to a modern mind may seem strange, even absurd. To them, these superstitions are not just stories, they are survival.
On such a ship, no act is meaningless. A simple whistle could be seen as reckless, a temptation for the winds to rise. A bird that lands on the rigging is not just a bird, it is a messenger, a spirit, perhaps even the soul of a sailor lost at sea. A cat, black as midnight, scurrying across the deck could bring luck or doom, depending on who witnessed it and where it ran.
Superstition gave order to chaos. If the sea was a god, or many gods, then rituals were the only way to keep it calm. Before a voyage, sailors poured ale into the waters, an offering to appease the deep. Others nailed coins under the main mast, a payment to the ocean itself, or perhaps to Davy Jones, the mythic warden of drowned souls. To ignore these traditions was not merely careless, it was inviting death.
Stories of disaster spread quickly among sailors. A ship that sailed on a Friday might never return. A crew that laughed at omens often paid the price with their lives. And while merchants and captains dismissed these tales in daylight, many would still be found quietly crossing themselves at night, whispering charms into the wind, or turning away when an albatross soared above.
For sailors, the world was layered with signs and symbols. Every sound, every sight on the open ocean carried meaning. The creak of timber, the roll of dice in a card game, the way the wind shifted at dusk, all were messages. To ignore them was to sail blind.
But these superstitions were not born from nothing. They were shaped by centuries of myth and religion. The Greeks had Poseidon, the Romans Neptune. The Norse spoke of Nord, master of the sea's bounty, while West African sailors prayed to Yamaya, the mother of waters. These gods were carried aboard ships not as statues, but as whispers, as customs, as rules never written, yet always followed. A man might not know the name of the deity, but he knew better than to anger it.
It was in this world of myth and uncertainty that sailors lived their lives. Every voyage was a gamble, and superstition was the only insurance they had. It gave them courage to climb the rigging in a storm. It gave them comfort when the sea claimed another crewmate, and it gave them hope that by obeying these hidden laws, they might one day return to the shore alive.
Yet superstition also held its darker side. When food ran low or storms grew unbearable, the crew would whisper about a Jonah, a cursed man among them, whose presence angered the sea. And more than once in history, such men were cast overboard to appease the waters. These were not just beliefs. They were acts, rituals, carried out with the grim certainty that the ocean demanded sacrifice. As the centuries passed, many of these traditions hardened into legend. They became part of the sailor's identity, woven into sea shanties, tattoos, charms, and carvings on ships. Some remain even today, in the quiet rituals of fishermen, in the traditions of naval ceremonies, and in the whispered stories told in port taverns. The strange superstitions sailors believed are not mere curiosities of the past. They are echoes of a time when the sea was vast and unknowable, when every wave might hide monsters and every storm might be a god's wrath. They remind us that for those who lived and died on the ocean, myth and history were never separate things. They were one and the same, bound together by salt, wind, and fear. And so, as the ship creaks and the waves crash, the crew leans on these superstitions. They whisper them into the night, carve them into wood, stitch them into their skin. For in the endless blue expanse, where death is always near, superstition is not madness, it is survival. To the sailor, the sea was never just a body of water. It breathed, it shifted moods, it punished and rewarded like a living creature, or more dangerously, like a god. Long before charts and compasses gave men some sense of control, the ocean was viewed as a realm ruled by divine powers, vast and unpredictable. Among the Greeks, Poseidon reigned supreme. His temper was legendary. A calm sea could turn violent in an instant, and sailors believed it was because Poseidon had taken offense. He was not merely a god in marble temples. He was there, in every wave, in every storm cloud forming on the horizon. Sailors prayed to him before setting sail, pouring libations of wine or oil into the surf. Offerings were made, sacrifices of animals thrown into the water, because to defy Poseidon was to risk your ship, your crew, and your soul. The Romans called him Neptune, and they carried his rites into their military fleets. Naval commanders spoke of paying the sea its due, and even hardened centurions crossing the Mediterranean grew quiet at the thought of Neptune's wrath. The empire's strength on land meant little in the face of storms, and so superstition traveled with them, cloaked as ritual. Further north, the Norse seafarers spoke of Njord, the god of winds and bounty, and of Aegir, a more sinister being who ruled the deep with his 9 daughters, each said to embody a different wave. For the Viking sailor, the sea was not simply traversed, it was bargained with. Mead was poured into the ocean, invocations whispered to ward off Aegir's hunger for men. And when storms rose suddenly, the Viking said Aegir had stretched out his hand, dragging warriors to feast in his hall beneath the waves. Across Africa, sailors of Yoruba tradition called upon Yemaya, the mother of waters, protector of fishermen and travelers. Her image was not one of wrath, but of care, yet even a mother could be angered. West African seafarers cast shells and beads into the sea, hoping to earn Yemaya's blessing for a safe voyage. These traditions carried across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships, where enslaved Africans prayed desperately to the waters, believing Yemaya would receive their suffering. To Chinese sailors, the goddess Mazu was the great protector of the seas. Temples dedicated to her stood along the coast, and fishermen and merchants alike prayed for her guidance. Sailors swore they had seen her appear above storm clouds, her red robes glowing like fire, steering ships away from rocks or lifting fog from the waters. For these men, the sea was not empty, it was full, brimming with spirits and gods watching every movement. And so, no matter the culture, the sailor's relationship with the sea was always deeply personal. They saw the ocean's moods as divine moods, its violence as punishment, its calm as blessing. Superstitions grew from these beliefs, binding men together in ritual. Before leaving port, some captains allowed no one to speak certain words aloud. To call the sea calm was dangerous. It might hear and take offense at being underestimated. Some sailors never named their destination at all, fearing that to do so was to boast in front of the waters, inviting disaster. Instead, they spoke in riddles or gestures, trusting that the sea listened closely.
Others carried tokens, coins nailed beneath the mast, charms worn around the neck, tattoos etched into skin. These were not decorations, they were contracts, small bargains with the sea itself. A sailor with a swallow tattooed on his chest believed he would always find his way home because the swallow always returned to land. An anchor on the forearm meant stability in storms, a promise that the sea would not claim him. For all their toughness, sailors never mocked the ocean. When the horizon grew too quiet, when the waves stilled as if holding their breath, the crew grew restless. Some would kneel and pray, others would mutter charms under their breath, spitting into the sea to distract it, offering tobacco or food scraps to break the silence, anything to remind the ocean that they respected its power.
Even silence itself could be ritual. A sudden hush among the crew was a sign of reverence, as though the ship had entered a sacred space. And in truth, it had. Every mile from shore was a mile deeper into the unknown, into a cathedral of wind and water where the rules of land no longer applied. The sea was alive. It tested men, rewarded them, and destroyed them. To the sailor, superstition was not foolishness. It was language, the only language that might reach whatever force lay beneath the surface.
For centuries, sailors told one another of men who defied this truth. A captain who mocked the gods, refusing to make offerings, only to vanish in a storm no one had seen coming. A fisherman who cursed the sea for taking his son, only to be pulled under himself days later. These tales, passed from port to port, grew into warnings etched into every sailor's mind. The sea was listening, the sea was watching, and the sea remembered. To modern eyes, it may seem like fear, but to the men who sailed wooden ships into the vast unknown, it was survival. They did not simply travel across the sea, they traveled within it, surrounded by its moods, subject to its will. And so they treated it as one would treat a living, breathing master, both feared and respected. Superstition, then, was not weakness, it was wisdom, for only a fool believed the sea was empty. Among all the strange rules of the sea, few were as universal or as feared as the ban on whistling. To the untrained ear, it seemed harmless, a sailor humming a tune, whistling to pass the endless hours. But to those who lived and died on the water, it was a dangerous provocation, a sound that tempted the winds to rise in anger. On the deck of a ship, silence could stretch for hours, broken only by the creak of timber and the slap of waves against the hull. In that silence, a whistle did not sound like music. It sounded like a summons. Sailors believed that the winds were spirits, fickle and unpredictable, and that a human whistle mocked them. To whistle was to call them, to invite their fury. "Never whistle on a ship," the older sailors would warn, "unless you wish for a storm." Stories told in taverns and forecastles spoke of men who ignored this warning. One tale described a young deckhand who whistled merrily as he coiled rope,
only for the skies to darken within the hour. The ship was battered by a squall so sudden, so violent, that men swore the storm itself had been conjured by his tune. Whether true or not, the lesson was repeated across generations. A whistle could summon the wind, and once summoned, the wind would not be controlled. Yet, as with all sailor beliefs, the superstition was not simple. Whistling was forbidden on deck, but in certain cases it was allowed, sometimes even encouraged. In the still, breathless calm of the doldrums, when sails hung limp and the crew grew restless under a burning sun, sailors might whistle deliberately, not as entertainment, but as a kind of ritual, a plea for the wind to return. A carefully chosen melody could lure the breeze back to the sails, just as an offering might coax a god into generosity.
The danger lay in excess. A whistle too loud, too playful, was arrogance. It suggested man could command the sea, and the sea did not tolerate arrogance. Even captains, men who often dismissed the fears of their crew, rarely challenged this particular superstition. Orders were barked, punishments carried out, but few captains dared to whistle themselves. To do so was to court mutiny, not from men, but from the elements themselves. Some historians argue that this fear had practical roots. On ships where sailors relied on sound signals, whistles, pipes, and calls to direct rigging and orders, a stray whistle could cause confusion. A man whistling for amusement might be mistaken for a signal in the chaos of wind and waves. A false order at the wrong time could cost lives. Over time, that danger blurred with myth until the whistle itself was seen not as careless, but as cursed.
But sailors did not need historians to explain their fears. To them, the proof was written across the horizon. Storms appeared without warning. Winds shifted in ways no man could predict. It was easy to imagine that some unseen force was listening, waiting for a careless tune to awaken its wrath. In some cultures, whistling was tied not only to storms, but to spirits of the dead. Among Celtic sailors, it was said that a whistle at sea could summon souls lost beneath the waves, spirits eager to drag the living down to join them. In the Caribbean, whistling at night was believed to call upon duppies, restless ghosts who haunted the shoreline and followed ships into the open sea. For African sailors, carried across oceans against their will, the whistle was a sound of summoning, a bridge between the living and the dead, and therefore a dangerous tool to wield without care. Even pirates, men famed for their brutality and recklessness, observed this rule. On decks where laughter and songs echoed freely, the whistle was rarely heard. To the pirate, whistling risked more than a storm. It risked bad luck, the kind of misfortune that could lead a prize ship to escape or a cannon to misfire in battle. To them, whistling was not only the voice of the wind, it was the voice of ill fortune. And so, on ships across the world, silence was safer. Sailors sang, they shouted, they argued and cursed, but when it came to whistling, lips stayed tight. If a man forgot himself and whistled, the others would glare, muttering charms under their breath, making the sign of the cross or spitting over the side to break the curse. Some captains punished the act harshly, not out of cruelty, but because fear could spread through a crew faster than fire. One careless whistle could unsettle the entire ship, leaving every man convinced that doom was near. It was not always storms that followed. Sometimes it was small misfortunes, a rope snapping, a mast cracking, a man slipping into the sea.
But for sailors, no accident was random. If a whistle had been heard, then the cause was clear. The sea had been mocked, and it had answered. And so the rule endured. Through centuries of change, new ships, new nations, new technologies, the superstition of the whistle lingered. Even today, among fishermen and naval crews, fragments of the old belief remain. Some say whistling on a ship invites not storms, but financial ruin, whistling away the wind and the profit with it. Others still mutter warnings, half in jest, when someone lets out a careless tune at sea. To land dwellers, the rule seems strange, even comical, but to the sailor of old, standing on the deck of a wooden ship in the middle of the endless ocean, it was no laughing matter. The whistle was a sound that could summon the unseen. A single note carried on the wind might bring calm, or it might bring ruin. And no man, no matter how skilled, could know which it would be.
Long before sailors understood the science of winds and currents, they learned to watch the skies. Birds were not simply creatures. They were guides, messengers, and omens. To see certain birds was to know that land was near, that food could be found, or that the gods themselves were sending a sign. Yet just as often, birds were feared. To harm one or to ignore its presence was to invite disaster. Of all the birds at sea, none loomed larger in superstition than the albatross. The albatross was a giant, its wingspan stretching wider than a man's height. It soared effortlessly above the open ocean, gliding for days without flapping, following ships across endless horizons. To sailors, the bird was uncanny, too great, too free, too strange to be mere flesh and feather. They believed it was something more. Among many crews, the albatross was thought to carry the souls of drowned sailors, wandering forever above the seas they could not escape. To see one meant that the dead still watched over the living, guiding them on their way. For this reason, to kill an albatross was one of the gravest crimes a sailor could commit. The punishment was not always from the crew, it was from the sea itself. Stories abounded of ships where a man, either through ignorance or hunger, shot an albatross with bow or musket. At first, nothing happened, but within days, storms rose, ropes snapped, food rotted, and men began to die. The crew would whisper that the albatross's spirit cursed them, and often the man who killed it was cast overboard in desperation, a sacrifice to break the spell. This superstition lived not only in whispers, but in literature. In the late 18th century, the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge gave it immortal form in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. In the tale, a sailor kills an albatross that had guided his ship, and the punishment is swift. The winds die, the sea grows still, and the ship is stranded. The crew, suffering under the blazing sun, turn on the mariner, forcing him to wear the dead albatross around his neck as a mark of his guilt. The image of the albatross around one's neck would echo through centuries, becoming a symbol of unbearable burden and inescapable curse. But Coleridge did not invent the superstition. He drew from the tales sailors already told, giving poetic voice to a belief older than his time. For sailors, the albatross was not merely a bird, it was the sea's chosen messenger, and its death was an act of blasphemy. The albatross was not the only bird woven into superstition. The petrel, small and dark, was called Mother Carey's chicken by British sailors. To see it skimming low across the waves was a warning stormy weather was near.
Petrels seemed to thrive in tempests, darting between the crests of waves, and so sailors grew convinced that they were born of storms themselves, children of a sea witch named Mother Carey, who conjured winds to feed her flock.
Gulls, too, carried meaning. They were seen as the souls of drowned men, much like the albatross, and to kill one was to invite the same fate. Sailors swore that gulls sometimes followed their ships for days, crying in voices that sounded eerily human, as though the dead were calling out from the beyond. Even the ordinary raven or crow had its place at sea. Norse sagas told of Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, who flew across the world bringing knowledge to their master. Viking sailors carried this myth into their own voyages, releasing ravens to find land when lost in fog. If the bird returned, they knew land was far. If it did not, they trusted it had found a shore nearby. In every case, birds were not simply animals. They were signs, interpreters of the sea's will. A flock circling overhead might mean fish below. A lone bird flying high and steady could mean land on the horizon. To ignore them was to ignore the language of the ocean itself. But superstition turned these signs into rules, and rules into taboos. A sailor who scared away a bird, or worse, harmed it, brought suspicion upon himself. If misfortune followed, if storms rose, if food spoiled, if a man fell ill, the crew would remember. Fingers would point, whispers would spread. And on a ship far from land, with death already close at hand, such whispers could turn dangerous.
It was not only European sailors who held such beliefs. In Polynesian traditions, birds were sacred guides across the vast Pacific. Navigators studied their flights carefully, using them to find islands scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. But beyond their practical use, birds carried spiritual weight. They were companions, guardians, and messengers from the gods. A bird alighting on a canoe was considered a blessing. To harm one was unthinkable. Among African sailors, birds were often linked to ancestors. Their sudden appearance or disappearance was read as a sign that the ancestors were watching. Some believed that when storms took men, their spirits returned as seabirds, circling above the waves forever. And so, across cultures, across centuries, the sky above the ocean was never empty. It was filled with wings, each carrying meaning, each demanding respect. The albatross, most of all, remained the bird of mystery. Enormous, silent, and tireless, it was the sailor's shadow, following across the endless sea. To see it was to know that others had gone before, that the dead themselves guided the living. To kill it was to sever that bond, to invite the wrath of the sea without mercy. Even today, in stories told by fishermen and in naval folklore, the shadow of the albatross lingers. Modern science explains its flight, its migrations, its uncanny ability to follow ships for weeks. But for the sailor, staring up at its vast wings, the old belief remains difficult to shake. The albatross is not just a bird. It is a ghost, a guardian, a curse. And so, as the ship sails onward, the crew watch the skies. They nod to the gulls, they whisper at the petrels, and they cross themselves when the great albatross glides above. For they know that the sea speaks not only through wind and wave, but through wings, and to ignore its messengers is to risk everything. From the earliest days of ocean voyages, there was one superstition that echoed louder than almost any other: the presence of women aboard ships. To some, it was the ultimate curse.
a guarantee of storms, bad luck, and mutiny. To others, it was the greatest blessing, the embodiment of fortune itself. For centuries, sailors carried this paradox with them. On one hand, they carved the figure of a woman into the bows of their ships, the figurehead, believing her gaze would calm the seas and guide them to safe harbor. On the other, they swore that a living woman aboard would anger the ocean, bringing misfortune upon all. How could both be true? The answer lay in the strange blend of fear, desire, and reverence that shaped seafaring life. Aboard a ship, life was harsh. Men were crammed together for months, facing hunger, storms, and the constant threat of death. The idea of a woman's presence unsettled this balance. Sailors believed it would stir jealousy, drive men to madness, and distract them from their duties. But beyond this social fear, there was something deeper, an ancient belief that the sea was itself a jealous woman. To bring another woman aboard was to provoke her wrath. And yet, paradoxically, the sea was also believed to respond to women in a way it did not to men. Many sailors whispered that a naked woman could calm a storm, her presence soothing the raging waters. This is why so many ships bore wooden carvings of bare-breasted maidens at their bows. These figureheads, painted and polished, were thought to charm the sea, guiding the vessel through peril. The woman carved in wood could protect them, but the woman in flesh was another matter.
Stories circulated across ports and taverns. One told of a Dutch ship caught in a terrible storm off the Cape of Good Hope. The crew fought for days until at last the captain's wife, hidden aboard in secret, was revealed. When she stepped onto the deck, the sea only grew wilder. Some swore she was cast into the waves to appease the storm, a sacrifice demanded by the ocean itself. Others said she stood defiant, her hair whipping in the wind until the storm broke and the ship survived. Which version was true depended on who told the tale, but the warning was always the same. Women at sea carried power. In some cultures, this power was seen as protective rather than dangerous. In Norse tradition, women were seeresses and keepers of fate. Saga tells of shield maidens and witches who could calm winds or summon them. Some Viking ships bore female guardians not as carved wood, but as living priestesses believed to watch the sea's moods. In Polynesian myth, goddesses of the sea often took the form of women who tested sailors' respect. To encounter one was perilous, but to honor her meant safe passage. Among Pacific navigators, women were sometimes voyagers themselves, carrying knowledge of the stars and waves. Here, the curse was not the woman's presence, but the man's failure to recognize her sacred role. European sailors, however, carried their fears well into the age of exploration. As late as the 18th century, naval codes discouraged women aboard. Yet history is filled with exceptions, women who disguised themselves as men to join crews, or who traveled openly as captains' wives. Some became legends in their own right. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the famous pirates of the Caribbean, disguised themselves as men to live the life of the sea. Their very presence defied the superstition, yet their notoriety seemed only to feed the myth. Women aboard meant danger, rebellion, and blood. Other women defied the superstition not with piracy, but with power. Grace O'Malley, the Irish pirate queen, commanded her own fleet in the 16th century. She was no curse to her sailors. She was their leader, feared and respected by those who faced her at sea. Still, for the common sailor, the taboo remained. A woman aboard was unpredictable, her presence capable of tipping the balance between fortune and ruin. And so, ships carried two women with them always. The carved figure at the prow, smiling or stern, her wooden eyes fixed on the horizon, and the sea herself, vast and jealous, her moods shifting with every tide. The flesh and blood woman, caught between these two, became the subject of endless myth. Perhaps the strangest contradiction of all was the belief that women's voices could either calm or curse the winds. Some sailors swore that the singing of a woman could smooth the sea like a lullaby to the waves. Others feared it, equating it with the call of sirens, those mythical beings whose songs lured men to their doom on hidden rocks. The siren myth itself blurred the lines between superstition and experience. Sailors often mistook manatees or seals for strange women of the sea. From afar, in the haze of exhaustion and drink, these creatures took on human form, feeding the legend of dangerous maidens in the deep. To hear a song on the wind was to wonder, was it the blessing of a woman's voice or the curse of a siren calling? By the 19th century, the superstition began to fade, challenged by modern navies and merchant fleets, where captains' wives often sailed. Yet the old beliefs lingered. Even today in maritime lore, the idea of the woman at sea carries both fascination and unease. What made this superstition so enduring was not only fear of the sea's jealousy, but recognition of women's symbolic power. They represented life, birth, and fate, all forces beyond a sailor's control. At sea, where men lived always on the edge of death, such forces felt dangerously close. And so the story of women aboard ships is the story of contradiction, a curse and a blessing, feared and worshipped, forbidden and yet secretly desired. They were the danger that could sink a ship and the figure that could save it.
As the sails of history give way to engines and steel, the old superstitions may seem quaint, even foolish. We know now that storms rise from weather patterns, not from angered gods. We know that birds follow ships for food, not to carry souls. We know that a black cat is only a cat, not a witch's familiar. And yet, step aboard a fishing trawler, a Navy destroyer, or even a modern yacht, and you will still hear them. A sailor might refuse to whistle, fearing it will whistle up a wind. Another will refuse to sail on a Friday, the unluckiest day at sea. Some still touch the carved figure at a ship's bow for luck, or greet the first albatross they see with respect. The ocean remains as vast, as dangerous, and as unknowable as it was centuries ago. And when men and women step onto its deck, leaving the safety of land behind, they still carry with them the old whispers. Superstitions are not merely relics of ignorance. They are stories sailors told to survive the unknown, to give shape to their fears, to bind their crews together against the endless deep. Myths, history, and belief blended until they became truth in their own right. And so, though science has explained the sea, the sailor's heart remains the same. He still looks to the horizon with awe, still feels the weight of old stories when the waves rise, still wonders if, perhaps, just perhaps, the sea is listening. For in every creak of the mast, in every shadow of wings above, in every whisper of the wind, the strange superstitions of sailors live on.